Hey there, viewers. Before we get into this intense story, I'm curious. What time is it for you right now? And are you a night owl or an early bird? Drop it in the comments. Tonight's story involves a late-night hospital run with Diddy, and what he confessed will send chills down your spine. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The Midnight Call. Nights in prison had their own rhythm, a certain hum that never really disappeared. Even when most of the block was asleep, the occasional cough from a cell, the distant shuffle of boots against concrete, the soft buzz of security cameras overhead, it all blended into a kind of background noise, something you got used to after years on the job. That's why, when my radio crackled to life at 12:04 a.m., I knew something was off. Midnight calls weren't standard procedure. If an inmate got sick, they went to the infirmary. If it was serious, transfers happened during the day under strict medical protocol. There were forms, signatures, an entire process. But when I reached for my radio, there were no details, just a direct order to report to the transport bay immediately. No names, no explanations. That was the first red flag. I rolled out of my cot, shaking off sleep, and threw on my uniform. My partner, Torres, was already up, pulling on his boots with a look that told me he was thinking the same thing I was. "You ever known them to run a hospital trip this late?" I asked, strapping on my duty belt. "Nope," Torres muttered, "and I bet you $20 this ain't just a checkup." I didn't take the bet. By the time we made it to the transport dock, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. 4 other officers were already there, looking just as confused as we were. Nobody spoke at first, just a lot of exchanged looks, hands resting near holsters, waiting for someone higher up to explain what the hell was going on. Then the warden walked in. That alone was unusual. The warden didn't oversee medical transports. Hell, he barely left his office unless it was a full-scale lockdown. But tonight, he stood in front of us, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. "You're escorting an inmate for a medical evaluation," he said, his tone clipped, businesslike. "Standard procedure. No complications." Bullshit. I glanced at Torres. His jaw was tight. We both knew the warden was leaving things out. "Who's the inmate?" someone else asked. There was a hesitation. Just for a second, but that second told me everything. "Sean Combs," he finally said. "Diddy." That got everyone's attention. We all knew who he was. Everyone did. A music mogul, a billionaire. Now, a high-profile inmate sitting in federal custody on some of the worst charges you could think of. And apparently tonight, he needed an urgent trip to the hospital. "What's wrong with him?" I asked. The warden's eyes flicked to me, and for the first time in years, I saw something in them that looked almost like discomfort. "Medical evaluation," he repeated. Nothing more. That was the second red flag. We were given no paperwork, no medical forms, no transfer orders, nothing in writing. Just a verbal order from above and instructions to move fast. That never happened. There was always documentation, a digital record at the very least, but not tonight. Tonight, we were just supposed to shut up and do our jobs. Something about that made my stomach twist. By the time we reached the secure holding area, Diddy was already waiting, and that was red flag number 3. Usually, inmates getting transported for medical reasons were woken up, processed, briefed, and brought out in stages. There was a process, a rhythm to it. But he wasn't in his cell. He wasn't even in the medical wing. Instead, he was in a private holding room near the back of the block, sitting fully dressed, hands in his lap, waiting. Like he had known this was coming. Torres and I exchanged another glance before stepping inside. Up close, he didn't look right. Diddy had always carried himself a certain way, even inside. Confident, smug, like a man who still believed he could buy his way out of anything. But tonight, he wasn't making eye contact. His fingers tapped a slow, nervous rhythm against his knee, and his skin. Something about it was off. Not pale, not exactly sickly, but just wrong. like someone who hadn't seen the sun in weeks, even though we knew he had yard privileges. "On your feet," Torres said. Diddy didn't move right away. For a second, he just sat there, staring at the floor. Then, almost too quiet to hear, he muttered, "It's happening, isn't it?" I frowned. "What's happening?" His gaze flicked up to mine, and for the first time that night I saw real fear in his eyes. "Nothing," he said. "Never mind." We cuffed him without incident. The whole way out to the transport van, he kept his head down, shoulders hunched, not saying a word. Not once did he fight the cuffs. Not once did he even glance at the other inmates watching from their cells. It was like he was already somewhere else in his head. By the time we reached the van, a senior guard stepped forward. He was an old-school guy, been at MDC for years, the type who never got rattled by anything. But tonight, he looked uneasy. As we loaded Diddy into the back, the senior officer leaned in close, speaking just loud enough for me to hear. "Keep your eyes open." I frowned. "For what?" The man hesitated. Then he just shook his head. "This ain't just a hospital run." And then he walked away. I climbed into the front seat, my hands tightening on the wheel as Torres locked the back doors behind us. Diddy didn't say a word. Neither did we. But as we pulled out of the prison, heading into the dark, empty streets of Brooklyn, I couldn't shake the feeling crawling up my spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a hospital trip. And somehow Diddy knew exactly what was coming. Chapter 2, The Ride into the Unknown. The night outside was still and empty, the city's usual hum of life dulled by the late hour. The streetlights stretched long shadows across the pavement as we drove, the kind that made everything feel stretched and unnatural. I'd been on enough late-night runs to know when something felt off, and tonight, something felt very off. Torres was driving, knuckles tightening on the wheel with every passing minute. I sat in the passenger seat, my eyes flicking between the mirrors and the empty road ahead. Diddy sat in the back, cuffed but completely still. That was the first thing that bothered me. Most inmates talked. Even the tough ones, the ones who acted like they didn't care, would at least ask where they were going or mutter something under their breath. But Diddy? He just sat there, head slightly lowered, his eyes fixed on something unseen, like he was listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. The van rumbled over a pothole, shaking us slightly, but he didn't react. Not a flinch, not a blink, just that same vacant stare, his fingers curled into loose fists on his lap. "Man, you're awfully quiet," Torres called back, forcing a chuckle to lighten the mood. "Ain't like we're driving you to the chair." Diddy didn't move, didn't speak. Torres glanced at me. What the hell is wrong with him? Before I could answer, the prison radio cut out. A loud burst of static filled the van, making both of us jump. The sudden, sharp noise crackled for a second, then dropped into complete silence. Torres swore under his breath, reaching for the radio. "You gotta be kidding me." He adjusted the dial, but there was nothing. No voices, no chatter from dispatch, just dead air. I grabbed my own radio and switched to a different channel. Still nothing. I felt a slow, creeping sensation at the base of my skull. The radio's cutting out wasn't normal. Not here. Not on a routine drive through the middle of Brooklyn. Torres banged the side of the radio in frustration. "Figures. Equipment in this place is older than dirt." But I wasn't so sure it was a technical issue. I glanced back at Diddy. He still wasn't moving, but now I could feel him watching me. "You ever feel like someone is watching you, even in the dark?" he murmured. His voice was calm, too calm. Torres let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "What, you paranoid now?" Diddy's gaze didn't shift. "I ain't the one who should be." The hairs on my arms stood up. I turned back toward the road, gripping the door handle a little tighter. That's when I saw the SUV. It was following us. Not tailgating, not speeding to overtake. Just there. A dark, unmarked SUV with tinted windows keeping perfect pace a few car lengths behind. It wasn't a police vehicle. No flashing lights, no identifying markings. Just silent, watching. I stiffened in my seat. Torres. He followed my line of sight in the mirror and let out a low whistle. That's interesting. How long they've been back there? You know, but they're sticking close, I'll tell you that. I tapped the dashboard. Switch lanes. Torres pulled into the next lane, casual, like he wasn't testing anything. The SUV did the same. I felt my stomach tighten. Try slowing down. Torres eased up on the gas. The SUV slowed too. A deep silence filled the van, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every breath, every shift of weight, every tiny movement. Then Diddy chuckled, low, almost amused. "You're gonna want to keep driving," he said. Torres clenched his jaw. "Who the hell are they?" Diddy leaned back against the seat, tilting his head slightly. "You ever hear the saying, dead men don't talk?" I turned to face him fully. "Enough with the riddles. What's the deal with this hospital? Why all the secrecy?" Diddy exhaled slowly, like he was debating something. "They don't want me healthy," he said. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something resigned. "They want me quiet." That wasn't an answer, that was a warning. I opened my mouth to press him, but Torres cut me off. "All right, I'm losing these assholes." He gripped the wheel tighter and took a sudden right turn down a side street. The SUV followed. "Shit," I muttered. Torres picked up speed, weaving through the empty streets. He didn't hit the siren, no point drawing more attention. But the van picked up enough momentum to make the tires whine against the asphalt. The SUV never fell behind. They didn't try to overtake, didn't flash their lights, just stayed there, like a shadow. I checked the side mirror, trying to get a better look at the driver, but the windows were pitch black, no reflections, no way to tell if it was one person or more. Diddy closed his eyes. "They're just making sure I get there, making sure nothing changes." I felt my pulse thudding in my ears. "Who are they, Combs?" He finally met my gaze again. His eyes were steady, but I could see it now. The exhaustion, the weight of something he wasn't saying. "You think I'm scared of prison?" he murmured. "You don't know what's really out there." Torres scoffed, gripping the wheel. "You got a fan club, is that it?" Diddy ignored him. His focus was on me. "You still think this is just a hospital visit?" I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure anymore. The SUV stayed behind us, never getting too close, never falling too far back. Just there, watching, like they weren't following us, but escorting us. Torres gritted his teeth. "You want me to make a break for the precinct?" I considered it. But something about this whole thing, it felt like we were already too deep. Like whoever was in that SUV knew exactly what they were doing. "No," I muttered. "Let's see where this goes." Torres let out a slow breath. "Fine. But if they so much as breathe wrong, I'm pulling us into a public lot and raising hell." I didn't disagree. Diddy turned back toward the window, his expression unreadable. We kept driving. The SUV followed. And somewhere in my gut, I knew this wasn't about medicine. This wasn't about his health. We were headed somewhere we weren't supposed to be. And Diddy? He had known that all along. Chapter 3. The hospital that wasn't a hospital. The ride should have taken 20 minutes, maybe 25 with the way Torres was driving, but it felt longer. The SUV never left us, always staying a few car lengths back, never making a move, never falling too far behind. Just there, watching. Diddy hadn't spoken much after that last cryptic comment, but I could feel him thinking in the back seat. His breathing was steady, but there was a tension in the way his shoulders were set, like he was preparing himself for something. Then, up ahead, Brooklyn Hospital came into view. Torres slowed the van as we approached the entrance, but the second I laid eyes on the place, my stomach turned. something was wrong. Hospitals, especially city hospitals, were never this quiet. There were no ambulances lined up outside, no paramedics rushing stretchers through the emergency doors, no tired nurses walking in for their night shifts. The parking lot was mostly empty, too empty for a facility that was supposed to be operating 24/7. Torres grunted. "This don't look right," I agreed. But the second we pulled toward the ER entrance, one of the security guards standing out front lifted a hand and motioned us away. "Not inside. To the side." Torres frowned but followed the silent instruction, pulling the van around the corner to a service entrance. No signage, no main doors, just a plain gray double door with one security camera perched overhead. A single red light blinked in the darkness. "Since when do we drop inmates at the back door?" I muttered. Torres didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the two men already waiting for us. They weren't hospital security. They weren't in uniform either. Black suits, no visible badges, no IDs, just standing there, hands folded in front of them like they'd been expecting us. I turned to Diddy. Still no reaction. He was looking down, not at the men, not at the doors, just at his hands. Like he knew what was coming next. A sharp knock at the driver's side window made us both jump. Torres rolled it down just enough to hear. One of the men leaned in. "No need for restraints. We'll take it from here." Torres glanced at me. I didn't like this. Not one bit. "That's not procedure," I said. "We don't take off the cuffs unless the medical staff requires it." The man didn't blink. "I'll do it now." My hand instinctively moved toward my holster. I wasn't going to draw, but I wanted him to see that I was ready to if things didn't feel right. And they didn't. Before I could push back, Diddy shifted in his seat. "It's fine," he muttered. "Let's just go." It was the first thing he'd said in nearly 10 minutes. I studied him for a moment. He wasn't tense. He wasn't trying to escape. If anything, he looked resigned. And that's what made it worse. I exhaled sharply, signaling Torres to unlock the cuffs. The moment they clicked open, Diddy rubbed his wrists absent-mindedly, but still didn't look at either of us. The two men in suits stepped forward, gripping him lightly by each arm, not roughly, not aggressively, just like they had done this before. Diddy let them. We followed them inside. The second we stepped into the building, the air changed. I don't know how else to describe it. The temperature was the same. The fluorescent lights buzzed just like they did in any hospital, but the energy of the place was... Hospitals usually had a sterile kind of chaos. Beeping machines, overhead announcements, voices from down the hall. This one had none of that. It was silent. No patients in the waiting room, no nurses at the front desk, just a single doctor standing at the end of the hall, clipboard in hand, waiting. Not moving, not checking his watch, just waiting. Torres muttered something under his breath. I didn't catch it, but I felt the same way. "This way," one of the suited men said. They led us down a hallway that looked normal enough. White tiles, linoleum floors, vending machines humming in the corner. But the further we walked, the more unnatural it felt. The air smelled... off. Not like medicine. More like chemicals. Something synthetic. The hallways were too clean, not a single piece of loose paper, no scuff marks from gurney wheels, no footprints, even though people had obviously been walking through here. I didn't know what I had expected, but it wasn't this. Then we stopped. One of the side doors slid open, revealing a private examination room. The doctor stepped forward but didn't introduce himself. No pleasantries, no small talk, just straight to business. "Come in," he said, motioning Diddy inside. Diddy didn't hesitate. I glanced at Torres. "Something don't sit right with me, man," he whispered. I didn't answer. The two men in suits stayed outside the door as Diddy stepped inside. Torres and I started to follow, but one of the suited men held up a hand. "That won't be necessary." Torres scoffed. "Like hell it ain't. We stay with the inmate at all times." The man didn't move. "The doctor needs privacy," he said. I took a deep breath. "If something happens, it's on you." The door slid shut. We were locked out. We stood there in the hallway, listening. For a while there was nothing. Then I heard it. A voice. Not Diddy's. The doctor's. But he wasn't speaking normally. He was whispering. Torres caught it too. He took a step forward, trying to peek through the observation window, but it was frosted over. My heartbeat picked up. I could barely make out the words, but the rhythm of the whispering was off. Too steady, too measured, like a script, like something being repeated. Diddy's voice never came. Then, a loud bang. I grabbed my baton, yanking at the door handle. "Open it!" The suited men didn't react. They didn't flint. They just stood there. Torres reached for his radio. Still dead air. The whispering stopped. Then, silence. I felt every hair on my body stand up. Something was very, very wrong. I pounded on the door again. What the hell is going on in there? No answer. A second passed. Then another. Then the door slid open. Diddy stepped out. His expression was blank. His wrists were red where the cuffs had been. The doctor stayed inside, his face unreadable. The suited men moved before we could say anything, grabbing Diddy's arms again, leading him back toward the hallway. I caught a glimpse of the inside of the room. The examination table was clean. Too clean. Like nobody had been in there at all. Diddy didn't say a word as they guided him back toward the exit. Neither did the doctor. Neither did we. We had more questions than answers. But something told me we weren't getting any tonight. Chapter 4. The confession begins. Torres and I didn't lower our hands from our holsters, not right away. The way Diddy had walked out of that room wasn't normal, not even close. He looked different. His face had gone pale, his skin slick with sweat, like he'd been running a marathon, but his breathing was slow, controlled, too controlled. His fingers were clenched in the fabric of his jumpsuit, knuckles white, his posture tense in a way I hadn't seen before. Torres took a step forward. What the hell happened in there? The doctor, if that's even what he was, barely glanced at us. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just a flick of his wrist, like we were dismissed. Neither of us moved. "Hey, I ask you a question," Torres snapped, stepping closer. The doctor sighed through his nose, like we were nothing more than an inconvenience. "He's fine," he said, turning toward the table, adjusting some unseen equipment. That was it. That was the only response we got. Torres let out a frustrated breath, but I shook my head. "Let's go," I muttered. He shot me a look like I'd lost my mind. "Are you kidding me? You're just gonna..." "Let's go." I didn't like it either, but standing here arguing wasn't going to get us answers. Something happened in that room, something they didn't want us knowing about. And if we pushed too hard, I had a bad feeling we wouldn't be walking out of here at all. Torres clenched his jaw but nodded, stepping back toward Diddy. The suits had already taken their places again, flanking him on either side like handlers guiding an animal. But Diddy didn't fight them. He just let them lead him back down the hallway, like a man walking himself to the grave. The ride back was worse than the ride there. Torres was pissed, hands gripping the wheels so tight I thought the leather might tear. I didn't blame him. I felt it too. That anger, that frustration, that gnawing, sick feeling in my gut, telling me we were part of something we didn't understand. Diddy sat in the back, his head tilted slightly toward the window, not looking at us, not looking at anything. He was breathing, but there was no life in his expression. For 10 full minutes, nobody said a word. Then I turned, finally breaking the silence. What the hell was that? Diddy didn't react at first. Torres glanced at me in the mirror, but neither of us looked away. "What did they do to you?" I pressed. Diddy blinked slowly. Then, so soft I almost didn't hear it, he chuckled. It was a tired, humorless sound. "You think this is about my trial?" he murmured. I felt something shift in my stomach. He turned his head slightly, eyes half-lidded, looking at me through the mirror. "You think they care about what I did?" Torres scoffed. "No offense, but yeah, I'd say they do. Ain't like you're in there for parking tickets." Diddy didn't smile, didn't argue. Instead, he let his head fall back against the seat, exhaling slowly. "You don't get it," he muttered. "Then help us get it," I said. Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, Diddy spoke. "It's not about prison, it's about making sure I never speak." Torres let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Man, what are you talking about? You're all over the news, you're already speaking." Diddy turned toward him. "Speaking publicly," he said, "not speaking the truth." I exchanged a look with Torres, but neither of us interrupted. Diddy stared at the back of the driver's seat, his expression unreadable, like he was debating how much to say. "They don't bring me there for treatment," he muttered. "They didn't bring me there because I'm sick." I felt my chest tighten. That was the moment I realized Diddy was never sick. Torres scoffed. "All right, man, then what the hell was it?" Diddy closed his eyes. I watched his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed, something flickering across his face. "I don't think it was fear. I think it was resignation." "You ever wonder why some people just disappear?" he asked. Torres frowned. "The hell does that mean?" Diddy exhaled. He opened his eyes again. "Sometimes it's a settlement, sometimes it's blackmail, but sometimes they don't want you dead. They just want you out of the way." Torres let out a humorless chuckle. "Sounds like some real tinfoil hat bullshit." Diddy turned to look at me. I don't know why, but I felt my pulse quicken. "You really think this is about my case?" he asked. I stayed quiet, because the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore. Diddy sighed, turning back toward the window. His fingers twitched against his jumpsuit. A nervous tick. "They don't need me to serve time," he murmured. "They just need me gone. Out of the picture. A problem they don't have to deal with." I leaned forward. "Who is they?" Diddy didn't answer. I heard Torres inhale sharply. "Oh, so now we're playing the pronoun game." Still, nothing. He just kept his eyes on the window, watching the city slip past, like he was seeing it for the last time. 10 minutes later, the prison walls came into view. Something inside me twisted at the sight of them. I should have felt relieved. That was the routine, right? Pick up the inmate, take them to the hospital, drop them back at lockup, another job done. But nothing about this felt like routine. Diddy had gone into that place one way and come out another. And whatever had happened in that exam room, it hadn't been medicine. The SUV was still behind us, still watching. I glanced at Torres. "You feel that?" He nodded. "Like we just drove a dead man home." We pulled into the transport dock. The other officers were already waiting, but they didn't move until the warden stepped out. Same unreadable face, same clipped tone. "Welcome back," he said. But he didn't respond. Neither did we. The SUV stopped at the edge of the lot. He didn't move, didn't pull in, just sat there, watching, waiting. Torres and I handed Diddy off, and as we walked away, I heard him whisper something. Not to us, not to the guards, to himself. Just one sentence, but it sent a chill straight through me. "They're not done with me yet." I didn't know who he meant, but I had a feeling we were going to find out. Chapter 5. The van that never made it back. The tension inside the van was suffocating. The silence wasn't normal, not the kind you get on a long drive where people are just too tired to talk. This was different. Torres kept his hands on the wheel, his fingers tight around the leather, knuckles almost white. The wipers squeaked against the windshield, brushing away the light drizzle that had started somewhere along the way. The rain wasn't heavy, but it made everything look slick, almost dreamlike under the dim glow of the streetlights. I shifted in my seat, glancing in the side mirror. The SUV was still there. It hadn't sped up, hadn't slowed down, just hovered in our blind spot, sitting at a careful distance. Watching, I exhaled through my nose and turned toward the back. Diddy was sitting perfectly still, his head slightly tilted toward the floor, staring at nothing. His breathing was deep, steady, but I could see the way his fingers tapped absently against his knee, a nervous habit. I cleared my throat. "Something you want to say?" He didn't move, didn't blink. Then, barely above a whisper, he chuckled. Not a happy laugh, a dry, hollow one. Then, he leaned forward. "You feel it too, don't you?" A shiver crawled up my spine. Torres glanced at me in the mirror, brows furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Diddy didn't answer immediately. He just exhaled slowly, his breath fogging up the glass between him and the front seat. Then, just as I was about to press him, the van lurched. "Heard." Torres swore loudly, jerking the wheel to regain control. My hand shot out, bracing against the dashboard. The radio let out a burst of static. Loud, violent, almost like a scream. Then, dead silence. I grabbed the handset. "Dispatch, this is transport unit." Nothing. No signal, no static, just an eerie, deafening absence of sound. Torres gritted his teeth. Goddamn radio's cutting out again. Then, as if on cue, the streetlights flickered. One by one, like a slow, deliberate chain reaction, the lights overhead blinked off. For half a second, everything was plunged into darkness. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Then, just as suddenly, the lights came back. I checked the mirror again. The SUV was gone. I stiffened. "What the hell?" Torres whipped his head around, checking his blind spots. "Where'd they go?" "Nothing. No headlights, no tire screech. Like they had never been there at all." My stomach churned. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Diddy exhaled sharply from the back seat, pressing his palms against his knees. His whole posture had changed. His usual arrogance, that lingering celebrity aura he still carried, even in cuffs, was completely gone. Now, he looked scared. And that scared me. Then, suddenly, he started talking. Not muttering, not rambling, confessing. "I didn't kill nobody, man, but I saw who did." I turned fully to look at him, but his eyes weren't on me, they were on the road ahead, like he wasn't really talking to us. Torres scoffed. "Yeah? That what you're telling the jury?" Diddy didn't blink. "You don't get it. This ain't about justice. It ain't about the law." His voice had an edge to it now, something sharp, something desperate. I swallowed. What is it about?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes locked onto mine in the rearview mirror. "About making sure I never talked." A weight settled in my chest. Then the van jerked again. Harder this time. Torres cursed, fighting to keep control. Something slammed into us from behind. My head whipped forward, my seatbelt locking tight against my chest. Torres wrenched the wheel, trying to correct the swerve, but it didn't matter. Another violent impact. Then we were airborne. The world spun, slow and heavy. The van flipped. Metal screeched, glass shattered, my body slammed against the door. Everything was upside down, inside out. A sickening crunch echoed as we hit the ground. Then, darkness. I wasn't out for long. I knew that because the world was still moving when I woke up. The van groaned, shifting under its own weight. I was on my side, my seatbelt digging into my shoulder. The air was thick with the stench of burnt rubber and leaking fluids. A metallic taste filled my mouth. Blood. I blinked hard, my vision swimming. My ears rang. Then, slowly, the world started coming back. I turned my head. Torres was slumped against the wheel, unconscious. I tried to call his name, but my throat was raw, my voice barely a rasp. Then, the realization hit me. The back doors. wide open. My pulse spiked. I twisted in my seat, ignoring the sharp pain in my ribs, trying to see. Diddy was gone. My stomach dropped. I unbuckled myself with shaky fingers, collapsing onto the shattered windshield as I pulled myself out of the wreckage. The road was empty. No traffic, no sirens, no SUV, no Diddy. I swallowed hard, scanning the area. Nothing. No footprints. No sign of a struggle. Like he had vanished into thin air. A cold, suffocating thought crept into my head. Did someone take him? Or did he walk away on his own? My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then, movement. Down the road, standing just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlights. A figure. Too far to make out details. But I knew. Somehow I knew. Diddy. My breath caught. What the hell? Then, he moved. Not fast, not running. Just walking. Calm, steady, purposeful. Like he wasn't escaping. Like he was going somewhere he was supposed to be. I opened my mouth to yell, to call out, but the second my voice left my throat, the lights flickered again. And he was gone. Chapter 6. The escape that wasn't an escape. The world swam back to me in broken fragments, flashes of metal, the sickening crunch of the van rolling, the brief weightlessness before the final impact. My skull pounded and my ribs ached with each breath. The air inside the overturned van was thick, choked with the sharp scent of burnt rubber and leaking fluids. I could feel something warm trickling down my forehead, a slow pulse of blood, but I couldn't focus on that. I turned my head. Torres. He was slumped against the wheel, a thin line of blood trailing from his temple. His breathing was shallow but steady. Good, he was alive. I exhaled, relief cutting through the haze in my head. But it was short-lived. Something was off. The back doors. They were wide open. I swallowed hard and twisted in my seat, ignoring the pain lancing through my ribs. My pulse spiked as I scanned the cargo space. The metal restraints were still bolted into place. The cuffs still locked. But Diddy? Gone. A slow, creeping chill settled into my bones. I forced myself to move, my limbs sluggish, body screaming in protest as I unbuckled my seatbelt and braced against the dashboard. The moment my boots hit the ground, my knees buckled, and I had to grip the edge of the van to keep myself upright. My vision swam, but I forced myself to focus. Where the hell was he? I expected signs of a struggle, drag marks on the pavement, broken restraints, footprints leading away. There was nothing. No scuffed dirt, no ripped fabric, no blood, just absence. I turned toward the road. The black SUV, gone. Not crashed, not abandoned, just missing. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. This didn't make sense. Even if Diddy had somehow slipped free, which was impossible, he wouldn't have vanished without a trace. I staggered forward, my boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. The wind had picked up, carrying the distant hum of the city in the background, but there was something unnatural about it. The world felt too still, like the aftermath of an explosion when the dust hasn't settled yet and everything holds its breath. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the road in both directions. Nothing. No headlights approaching, no sound of sirens. My gut twisted. Something was watching me. Then, movement. I snapped my head up. Down the road, just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlight, a figure stood perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. He was too far away to see clearly, but I knew. Diddy. A cold wave of adrenaline crashed over me. How? He was just... I opened my mouth to yell, to demand an answer, but the second my voice left my throat, the lights flickered again, and he was gone. I took an involuntary step forward, heart hammering, trying to process what I had just seen. My instincts screamed at me to get closer, to check, to confirm, but something in the back of my mind whispered a warning. Don't. A groan from behind me broke the spell. Torres. I turned and hurried back to the wreckage. He was shifting now, his fingers twitching as he let out another low groan. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, before finally locking onto mine. What the hell? His voice was hoarse, thick with pain. I crouched next to him. You good? He winced as he tried to move. I feel like I got hit by a damn train. What happened? I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That Diddy had somehow vanished into thin air? That the black SUV we'd been watching for miles had just blinked out of existence? That for a split second I had seen him standing there, staring back at me, before he disappeared like a ghost? I swallowed. Crash was bad. You blacked out. Torres groaned, rubbing his head. Yeah, no shit. Where's Combs? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Torres frowned. Then his gaze shifted past me to the open back doors of the van. His face paled. You're telling me we crashed and he just walked away? I exhaled, rubbing my temples. I don't know, man. I don't know what I saw. Torres cursed, slamming his fist against the dashboard. How the hell does a man in handcuffs disappear without a trace? I had no answer. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us breathing heavily, the weight of the situation sinking in. Then, in the distance, the faint wail of sirens broke through the quiet. Help was coming, but I had a sinking feeling it wouldn't matter. This wasn't a simple escape. This wasn't just a prisoner running. I could feel it. Something bigger was at play. And whatever it was, we were never meant to see it. The rest of the night blurred. The backup team arrived. Paramedics checked us over. Questions were asked. So many questions. But the moment we started talking, I saw it. The shift. The way their expressions went from concerned to calculating. I could tell they already had an explanation, an official one. One that wouldn't involve black SUVs, dead radios, or prisoners who vanished into thin air. Torres tried to fight it. He told them everything. The crash, the flickering lights, how Diddy had been there 1 second and gone the next. But the more he talked, the more they looked at him like he was crazy. I kept my mouth shut. Not because I didn't believe him, but because I knew it wouldn't matter. The report they filed? Mechanical failure, caused loss of control. Diddy escaped during the accident. The hospital transfer did not occur. The security footage? Unavailable due to a system error. I wasn't surprised, but I still felt sick. They had erased it, the entire night, like it had never happened, like we had imagined it. Torres sat beside me in the ambulance, his jaw clenched, fists tight. He leaned in, voice low. You know this is bullshit, right? I nodded. Then what the hell do we do? I stared at the ground, the pit in my stomach growing deeper. I don't know. But one thing was clear. We weren't supposed to remember this night, and the people who made sure of that. They weren't done yet. Chapter 7. The aftermath no one talks about. The rain had stopped by the time the backup units arrived. The city had that eerie, post-storm stillness to it, the kind that makes everything feel hollow, like the world had pressed pause. Red and blue lights flashed against the wet pavement as officers and paramedics surrounded the wrecked transport van. But it didn't feel like a rescue. Torres and I were pulled from the scene like crash victims, but that wasn't what this was. We weren't being saved. We were being collected. The paramedics moved methodically, their faces blank as they checked us over for injuries. I could feel them watching me, not with concern, but with calculation, like they were taking mental notes of how much I remembered. Torres was still seething, cursing under his breath, demanding answers, but no one was answering him. No one even acknowledged his questions. Then I saw the suits. They weren't wearing uniforms. They weren't part of the NYPD or federal transport. They were something else. Men with cold, expressionless faces, standing just beyond the line of officers, observing. No conversation, no orders, just watching. Something about them sent a chill straight to my bones. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Torres, sitting beside me on the open ambulance bumper, wiped the blood from his temple and muttered, "You see them?" I nodded, "Yeah." His jaw tightened. "Who the hell are they?" I didn't answer, because I already knew. They weren't here for the accident. They weren't here for us. They were here to clean up, and that's exactly what they did. The official report was written before we even left the scene. The investigating officers barely looked at the wreckage before filing their statements. It was too neat, too controlled. Torres fought it at first. "This is bullshit," he snapped, pushing past the officers crowding around the van. "We had a prisoner in that transport. Where the hell is Combs?" One of the responding sergeants barely looked at him. "There was no prisoner in the vehicle." Torres froze. "What?" The sergeant didn't even blink. This was a routine transport run. The van suffered a mechanical failure. The officers on board sustained minor injuries. I felt my stomach drop. Torres let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Are you serious? Are you actually?" "The prisoner never left the detention center," the sergeant cut him off. The words hit like a brick to the chest. I turned sharply. "That's not true." The sergeant turned toward me, and for the first time his expression changed. Not anger, not annoyance, something more dangerous. "A warning." He said nothing. He didn't have to. Torres, on the other hand, wasn't built for silence. "This is a goddamn cover-up," he shouted. The officers didn't flinch. That's when I realized they weren't just ignoring us. They had been told exactly what to say. Every single one of them. This wasn't just a rewrite of the events. It was an erasure. No records of the hospital transfer. No cameras catching us leaving the detention center. No medical files showing Diddy was ever examined. The doctor never worked at Brooklyn Hospital. The black SUV never existed. Torres turned to me, looking for backup, but I was too busy processing what this meant. They weren't just covering for something. They had been prepared for this. They knew we would crash. They knew Diddy would be gone. They knew we would ask questions. And they had answers before we even opened our mouths. We were escorted back to the detention center, but not in the way officers should be. There were no debriefings, no internal investigation. A quiet removal. Torres sat next to me in the back of the police cruiser, his knee bouncing restlessly. He wasn't just mad, he was on edge. "I'm not letting this go," he muttered. I exhaled slowly. "Torres, no. I mean it, this is bigger than us." He turned, his eyes sharp. "You know that, right?" I nodded. "I know. But knowing and doing something about it, those were two different things." When we got back to the precinct, we were separated immediately. I didn't see where they took Torres, but I was led down a hallway, away from my usual station, away from my desk, to a room that I had never been in before. The door closed behind me, and for a moment I was alone. Then, after a beat, he walked in. Not a captain, not a commanding officer. A man I had never seen before, wearing a plain dark suit, no badge, no nameplate. He sat across from me, folded his hands, and studied me for a long moment. I didn't speak first, neither did he. Then, finally, he said, "It's a dangerous thing, asking too many questions." My pulse spiked. His voice was calm, not threatening, just stating a fact. I swallowed hard. "I just want to know what happened out there." His lips barely curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No, you don't." My hands clenched into fists. "Was it an extraction?" I asked, pushing forward. "Did someone take him, or did you let him go?" He studied me, silent for just a moment too long. Then he leaned forward, his voice so low I almost didn't hear it. Forget what you saw. I felt the weight of those words settle into my bones. What if I don't? I asked. His face didn't change, but his eyes darkened. Then he stood up, adjusted his suit, and before he left, he said one last thing. If you don't, you'll end up like him. The door clicked shut behind him. I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding. Not because I didn't understand what he was saying, but because I did. This wasn't about Diddy anymore. Torres and I were never supposed to remember this night. And now we have problems too. Chapter 8. The last thing he said. The days blurred together after that night. The precinct felt different, not in any obvious way, but in the kind of way where people knew something had happened but weren't saying it. Eyes lingered a little too long, conversations stopped a second too late. No one asked me about the crash, no one brought up the missing prisoner. Diddy's name never crossed a single person's lips. Torres and I stopped talking about it too, not because we didn't want to, but because we knew better. We had both been moved to separate shifts, different assignments, no explanation, just quietly reassigned. Torres took it worse than I did. I caught glimpses of him in the halls, his face drawn tight, jaw clenched. He looked like a man fighting against himself. Like he wanted to scream, but he knew no one would listen. That was the worst part. Not the threats, not the erasure. It was knowing that the world had already moved on, and we had no choice but to move on with it. Weeks passed. The first few nights after the crash, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that flickering streetlight, that empty road, the way Diddy had stood there, motionless, before he vanished, like he was never there at all. I told myself it was just adrenaline, that my head wasn't clear that night, that I had imagined it. But I didn't believe it. And whoever was watching us, they didn't believe it either. The package arrived on a Tuesday. It was small, unremarkable, just a plain white envelope tucked into my personal mailbox at the station. No postmark, no return address. Someone had delivered it by hand. For a long moment, I just stared at it. My stomach twisted. My hands felt too still. I glanced around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. Officers moved in and out of the briefing area, chatting about their cases. Just another regular day. But this wasn't regular. Not anymore. I picked up the envelope. It was light, too light. No weight, no objects inside, just a single sheet of paper. I took it back to my car. I wasn't going to open it at my desk. If someone wanted me to find this, they already knew where I was. I sat behind the wheel, locked the doors, and tore it open. Inside was one sentence. You don't find the truth finds you. At the bottom, a signature. Diddy. I just stared at it, my mind racing. Was it really from him? Was it a warning? A message? A goodbye? Or was it something else entirely? I flipped the paper over. My breath caught in my throat. There, scribbled in the same messy, uneven ink, was a set of coordinates, a location. For a long moment I just sat there, gripping the note, my pulse pounding. Every instinct screamed at me to throw it away, to burn it. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I pulled out my phone, my fingers slightly unsteady, and punched in the coordinates. The map loaded slowly. Then, finally, it dropped a pin. I felt a cold shiver slide down my spine. It wasn't random. It was a place, a very specific place. One I recognized. An abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn. A place where, years ago, Diddy was rumored to have held his infamous private parties. The kind of place where things happened that never made the news. I stared at the screen, my mind churning. This isn't over. And maybe, just maybe, Diddy isn't either.